My presentation is about anxiety, PTSD, and depression following induced abortions. So abortion is a very common procedure in the United States. In fact, according to the Guttmacher Institute, 1 in 5 women get abortions in 2017. Now there's two types of abortion. There's medical abortion, which is the oral administration of the drug mifepristone, which causes the fetus to be expelled, and then there's surgical abortions. And in surgical abortions, the surgeon uses a vacuum to remove the fetus and then goes through with a curette to remove the remaining parts. Now, abortion has been shown to impact mental health. There is a condition called post-abortion syndrome, which is very similar to PTSD in the fact that it causes feelings of intense grief. And there's also been some studies that show that those who have abortions have a greater likelihood of developing anxiety, PTSD, and depression. There's also literature that says that abortion really doesn't negatively impact mental health. So, therefore, there needs to be more research on this topic. There needs to be more research that uses better research methodology to elucidate the relationship between abortion and mental health. Now, some studies that show abortion negatively impacting mental health are as follows. Russett examined the relationship between the type of abortion performed and the likelihood of developing PTSD. They found, and the participants were 86 participants, and they came from France. The results of the study were that 33% of the medical abortion group and 28% of the surgical abortion group showed anxiety and depressive symptoms. Now, if you compare this to the statistic of women having depression in the general population of the United States, the statistic from the study is way higher. In fact, in the US, only 8.7% of the general population of women have depression. And then the study also found that post-abortion, the medical abortion group scored 36% on PTSD symptoms, and the surgical group scored 26%. Now again, when you compare this to the population of women who have PTSD in the general population, you'll see that that statistic is way smaller, 5.2%. Another negative study on abortion, Mota studied the relationship between abortion and mental disorders and suicidal ideation. And the sample is quite large. 3,310 women in the U.S., and they used the census to get this data. The rate of PTSD was higher in women who had abortions, about 16.8%, and the women who did not have abortions only had 8.9% PTSD likelihood. Probability of women developing depression after their first abortion was 48.8%. That's almost half. Suicide attempts were insightful too. Suicidal ideation was 13.8% higher in women who've had abortions, and the attempts were 17.5% higher. Now, there's also studies that show that abortion positively impacts your mental health. In a study performed by Caro, the long-term effects of abortion on well-being and mental growth were assessed in 250 women in the Netherlands. And to do this study, they asked them about their experience of abortion and with a questionnaire, and they rated their responses in 3 categories. The first category was whether they had positive feelings about their abortion. Second category was negative feelings, and third category was positive and negative feelings. And the findings were that 74% of women associated their abortion with feelings of relief and mental growth, whereas 55% also had positive experiences with it, and 2/3 didn't report any emotional distress at all. Another positive study completed by Boersma researched the likelihood of developing depression in people who have had induced abortions in Krakow women. There was 92 women in this study, and they used the CESD scale for measuring depression. They found that the risk for depression actually went down by 30% if you had an abortion. The control group also had the same risk for depression as the experimental group. The present study will investigate the relationship between abortion and the likelihood of developing anxiety, depression, and PTSD. using multiple ethnicities of women that have had their first induced abortions. Symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD will be monitored via face-to-face sessions for a week before the abortion or birth, 3 months after the abortion or birth, and then annually for a period of 4 years. I predict that those who choose to have an abortion will be more likely to develop PTSD, anxiety, and depression than the women who chose to give birth. So the participants, they were ages 18 to 36, and they were having their first unplanned pregnancies or were considering their first abortions. And we recruited these participants from women's care centers and Planned Parenthood clinics in 4 different states. The states were Indiana, North Dakota, Maryland, and Florida. And eligible participants had to complete a questionnaire to control for demographics. Demographics were race, income, educational status, and relationship status. And then the total of participants was 380 participants. 170 were in the control group, which is the birth group, and 210 were in the experimental group, which is the abortion group. So materials. To measure depression, we used the CESD scale. To measure anxiety, we use the Beck Anxiety Inventory. And to measure PTSD, we use the Impact of Events scale. So the procedure, and each session took place 3 hours, and in each session, the psychologists vaguely explained what the study was about. They also took measurements with the scales that I mentioned earlier, and they explained to the participants how to use the scales, and they recorded the info. Ethical considerations. This was a completely anonymous study. We used codes instead of names, and also each participant got $500 for participating. And they were told they could drop out if they needed to, and that they would still get the incentive. And also, if any of the participants showed any mental health concerns, they were given 3 months of free mental health care counseling. And lastly, of course, the participants all had to sign a written consent form in order to participate in the study. So statistics, 3 separate 2x6 group by time mixed factorial ANOVAs were performed to see if there was a relationship between having an abortion and developing these mental disorders. And significant findings were followed by a Newman-Coles test. So results for depression, going to be referring to the graph. So in pretest 1, the abortion group scored higher than the birth group in depression. In post-test 1 and post-test 2, there was no difference between groups in depression, but in post-test 3, 4, and 5, the abortion group scored higher in depression. In anxiety, at pretest and post-test 1, the abortion group scored higher, but in post-test 2, 3, and 5, there really wasn't much of a significant difference between groups. But if you look at the graph, and you'll see on the PowerPoint I send you, the line for abortion was still higher than the birth group. For PTSD, in the pretest and post-test 4 and post-test 5, there really wasn't a significant difference between groups. But at post-test 1, 2, and 3, abortion group is scoring higher for PTSD. So, implications. Overall, my hypothesis was supported by my data. Those who chose to have an abortion had a greatly likelihood of getting depression, anxiety, and PTSD than those who didn't have abortions. Some implications of these findings is that resources should really be poured into women's clinics to give them the resources they need to raise their first children. So maybe they won't consider abortion as their only option. And then also, in sex education, abortion should be a topic that should be covered so people can be more knowledgeable of it. And also, mental health care professionals need to be knowledgeable of the risks associated with abortion when treating their clients. Lastly, counseling services need to be provided to women who have had abortions so they can experience healing. Some strengths and weaknesses of this study is that a good strength, it has samples of 4 different states, and also we were able to effectively monitor the symptoms of women longitudinally. Some weaknesses, each session was 3 hours, which means that some of the participants could have gotten tired during the sessions, which may have made some answers dishonest. And then lastly, we didn't consider the influence of social support as a variable in women choosing to have abortions. So that brings me to future research. The role of social support should be included in determining if women have abortions and why they do. And then also the role sexual education plays in women choosing to have abortions should be researched. And lastly, the role faith plays in healing from an abortion should be researched. Thank you.